Do you want to catch bass like this? Do you want to fish like the experts and catch more bass, more consistently, under the toughest conditions? Then this program's for you. You'll see that you can become a good bass angler, maybe even a really good one. That's because this program shows you the reasons why the experts are so successful. And when you understand the whys behind the sport, the how-tos make a lot more sense. Doug Hannon is going to show you why he has caught more than 400 largemouth bass weighing over 10 pounds. His lifelong dedication to unveiling the mysteries of big bass and their watery world has earned him the title, the Bass Professor. Charlie Farmer is a top outdoor writer who has spent years studying the techniques and ideas of professional anglers, a career that has made him a top-notch fisherman. Al Lindner is recognized as America's best all-around angler for freshwater game fish. With his fishing knowledge and teaching ability, he has helped improve the skills of hundreds of thousands of anglers. Al Lindner, Charlie Farmer, and Doug Hannon are all masters of the sport. They catch bass consistently, even under the toughest conditions. They catch bass on purpose. Each of these experts has his own unique ideas and techniques, but all three have something in common. They achieve mastery of the sport by following a formula for success. In this program, you'll see how these experts use the 3M Mastery Formula for success, solving the problems that all anglers face. Problems like finding the fish. Do you feel intimidated by a new lake or reservoir? You'll see how to look at a body of water like the bass does and find the best spots to fish. Are you frustrated by day-to-day changes in fishing conditions? You'll learn that bass have distinct behavior patterns that you can predict. Do you feel confident that you can always pick the best lure? You'll find out there's an easy-to-understand process for selecting the right bass lures. This one program can't give you everything you need to be a successful bass angler, but it will introduce you to the wealth of knowledge contained in 3M's Bass Fishing Series. And with the 3M Mastery Formula for Success, you can start your journey on the road to mastery of the sport. Let Al Lindner tell you what the formula is.
Our formula for success has 3 variables. First, you have to know how to locate the fish. Secondly, an understanding of how the fish are behaving in a given environment is important. And third, making the right presentation for the conditions you're faced with. Put them all together and you're going to be successful. Location means being able to find the fish. You need to know the locations that a natural lake offers. You have to know when groups of active fish are probably using those locations, and you need to know the small spots within a location that the bass are most likely using. Behavior means being able to take advantage of, or at least cope with, the fish's basic nature. You have to know why the fish are using a location and how the fish respond to changing conditions. Presentation means being able to select a lure that's just right for the location you're trying to fish and matches the behavior of the fish in that location. Presentation includes other essential skills, like reading a depth finder, handling a boat, casting accurately, and choosing the right equipment.
Location, behavior, and presentation. With the formula for success, master anglers don't rely on luck. They make things happen, even in the toughest conditions. The formula helps Charlie Farmer know that there are bass using deep structure way out in the middle of the lake, a spot that few other anglers know about. By following the formula for success, Doug Hannon finds the shallow water locations that hold really big bass, and he picks the lures that will fool an older, more experienced fish. Lindner uses the formula to locate trophy-sized fall bass in their deep water haunts. He knows that only a slow, deliberate presentation will match the behavior of these cold water fish.
As you improve your skills in all three areas, finding the right locations, understanding how the fish are behaving, and making the right presentations, you're going to be catching a lot more fish and having more fun doing it. However, if you neglect any of these areas, you could get frustrated. Oh, sure, you're going to be catching a few more fish, but not as many fish as you should be catching. Hey, you know, along with the ability of catching fish like this consistently comes a sense of responsibility. That's right, responsibility. You know, I believe in catch and release. I practice it a lot. And I believe you should too. Hey, I'm not saying take every bass you catch and put them all back. There's nothing wrong with keeping a few fish for the table now and then, but definitely learn to take some of your fish and release them. It helps ensure the future of quality fishing for all of us.
Big bass, particularly those caught in very warm water, may need a little extra help when you release them. Doug Hannon and other experts recommend using a catch and release formula in your live well. Chemical compound helps the bass recover from the stress of being caught and ensures that she'll live to challenge another angler's skills another day. Is it really that simple? Can you have a formula for success in bass fishing? You sure can, if you plug in the right information. The formula for success is not just a grab bag of tips and tricks and luck. It describes the science of fishing, the basic principles of the sport. Sure, you can go out with a few tips and catch bass by accident. But what if you run into a new situation that your tips don't cover, or tough fishing conditions? That's when fishing turns to frustration. The formula for success helps you analyze a fishing situation, even one you've never experienced before. Where are the bass located? How are they behaving? What kind of presentation will match the location and behavior of the bass? You'll be able to answer those questions and catch more bass, more consistently than ever before. Let's start with the location factor. A master angler like Doug Hannon can look at a body of water and literally see the areas where the bass may be located. You can develop this ability too. Not by just remembering all the possible locations bass use, but by keeping one big idea clear in your mind. To survive, bass need specific conditions. Let the bass professor tell you how to find those conditions.
Let's take a look at the structures or places that a bass needs. You notice we didn't say like. Bass does not like or dislike anything per se. And one of the mistakes that people make is to think of bass in terms of our own human emotions. This is only going to compromise our ability to deal with him strictly as a fish. Bass are object-oriented fish. That is, they spend a great deal of their time on or around both natural and man-made objects.
Bass locate themselves next to objects because that's where their food supply tends to be. Objects in the water, such as weeds, fallen timber, rock piles, and so on, serve as a home for microorganisms. Crustaceans and small fish are attracted to that food source and are in turn eaten by the bass. As you can see in these shots from the Glenn Lau film, Feeding Habits of the Bass, largemouth bass are an ambush-type fish. They use objects as cover to conceal themselves from prey, dashing out to capture food, sucking it in by opening their bucket mouths. In natural lakes, shoreline weeds attract bass. They're a lush environment, full of small fish and aquatic animals, a food source that attracts bass. Bass also relate to the weeds on flats. those waters from about 5 to 10 feet deep. In reservoirs, flooded timber provides the objects and ambush points that bass need. And man-made objects like bridges and boat docks attract groups of bass too. In some reservoirs, bass relate to old buildings and riverbeds in 30 to 40 feet of water. And as Charlie Farmer points out, the objects or structure that bass relate to are not always solid.
We think of water as an element that is totally the same throughout. However, water in deeper lakes over 25 feet stratifies in summer. The warmer upper layer is called the epilimnion. The lower layer, the hypolimnion, is below the sun's rays and cooler. By mid to late summer, the hypolimnion is void of life-giving oxygen. Between these extremes is a buffer zone that is called the thermocline. Expert fishermen put this knowledge to use. They use it to further isolate the places in the lake that are most likely to hold bass. In fact, the thermocline will be sufficient structure to attract schools of bass. They can be found in this comfortable liquid sanctuary, especially in lakes that offer deep submerged timber. Depth sounders and especially chart recorders are a must for finding these schools of bass, which are often a long way from shore. With the proper tools for deep water fishing, fishing these schools can mean some fast, exciting action.
The bass is a versatile fish that can survive in many different kinds of locations. That's why the location factor in the formula for success is so important to experts like Charlie Farmer and Doug Hannon.
Our understanding of the basic environmental needs of a bass can be very useful in evaluating and eliminating unproductive water. The biggest mistake we can make is to look at the cover or the place we're fishing in terms of what looks good to us, rather than what is good for the bass.
By knowing what conditions bass need to survive, we can find the locations they're most likely using. That's a basic principle of bass fishing, but it would be a mistake to think of those locations as a permanent address. A body of water goes through tremendous changes from season to season. Water temperature, availability of food, growth of cover, all these factors determine bass location. As conditions in the lake change, bass move to different locations, following a distinct pattern. The annual cycle of movement is another big idea that experts use as part of their formula for success. This contour map of a typical natural bass lake illustrates the annual cycle of movement. Cold temperatures in the 40s and low 50s cause the bass to move into the deeper waters of the lake. In the spring, when shallow water warms to the upper 60s and lower 70s, bass move into shoreline areas to spawn. As shown in the Glen Lau production, Big Mouth, bass need warm water to hatch their eggs. So they will generally head for the shallowest areas in a lake. Food is not a major concern now for the bass. The male bass needs to find a good nest-building site. Then attract a female bass. And defend the nest from hordes of marauding bluegills. The abundant plant growth of summer spreads groups of bass throughout the lake. Now there is plenty for the bass to eat, and they feed heavily, giving the master angler plenty of opportunities to catch them. The steadily falling temperatures of autumn drive the bass back down into the stable conditions of deep water. As a cold-blooded creature, the bass's metabolism slows to a crawl, with even the biggest fish feeding only occasionally. From the deep drop-offs to shallow water, to locations at all depths, and back to deeper water. Over and over, the cycle repeats itself every year. Master anglers agree that understanding the location factor is the key to successful bass fishing. Knowing the conditions that bass need for survival and how the conditions in a body of water can change from season to season. But how do you actually make use of that information? How do you get on a lake and read it to find the fish? The key is to build an image of the lake in your mind, a mental picture of the locations bass use. Let's see how Charlie Farmer uses a lake map to build a mental picture of one important structure, a migration route that bass use to go between deep and shallow water.
You're looking for a pathway from the deep water to shallow water, and this pathway must extend all the way from both. This is why points or bars often hold bass. These tongues of land create a relatively flat route that ends with a ledge or drop-off right at the edge of the deeper water. On a topo map, this is where the contour lines are closer together. These drop-offs are called a contact point because this is where bass will linger on the way into or out of the deep water sanctuary. The migration route itself will be marked with an occasional structure for the bass to find cover on. This is why areas with loose rock, standing timber, or stumps are excellent for bass fishing. The better contour maps will show timbered areas. A bass migration will begin at one end of these contact points, continue along the migration route until the school of bass reaches some point in shallow water where they disperse. This is called a scatter point.
A topographic map helps you understand what the lake looks like beneath the surface. It helps you build a mental picture that will guide you to the fish. But as Al Lindner points out, sometimes you need more than a lake map.
A lake map is a good place to start, but it doesn't show all the good spots. The fact is, some of the best locations on a lake won't be on a map. The contours are simply too wide to pick up those key defined areas that attract most of the bass. When I fish a lake for the first time, I always map it out myself. Using my depth finder, I follow the weed line or first drop-off all around the lake. Then I crisscross the lake in a checkerboard pattern to check out the deep water.
Obviously, there are limits on the type of strategy Al Lindner is talking about. He wouldn't try to map out a whole reservoir like the one Charlie Farmer is fishing. But the principle is the same in both cases. The experts literally build a model of the lake in their minds.
When I'm running the weed line, I'm always making mental notes. Here's a sharp drop-off with good cover on top. Here's a little inside corner, a little point that normally wouldn't show on a map. Here's an area that has no cover, drops off quick, it's not worth my time. Here's a major structural element, in this case a big point. It drops off quick here, a slow taper here. Got a bunch of fish suspended off of this corner. I continue along the drop-off, another little point here, another structural element that's big. Follow it all the way around to where I started. Then I'd go up in the shallow water to see what the cover looks like here. Then I'd come out in the main lake and kind of zigzag across it, almost like a checkerboard effect. That's how you find these deep, subtle humps like this that normally wouldn't show up on a map. Hey, I highly recommend taking the time to do this. Believe me, it's worth the effort. It's the best way I know to get a mental picture of what the lake bottom looks like.
Do you find yourself lost and frustrated on waters that you've never fished before? The location factor shows you how to quickly eliminate unproductive water and concentrate on likely spots. Do you keep on going back to the same few locations that you regularly fish? The location factor helps you identify all the possible bass locations in a body of water. Do you stick to the summer months and let the trophy bass of fall evade you? With the location factor, you can find the bass at any point in their annual cycle of movement. By using the 3M Mastery Formula for Success, location plus behavior plus presentation equals success. You can improve your ability to consistently find and catch bass under all conditions. The location factor puts you in the right spot to catch bass, but they aren't going to just jump in the boat. To catch more bass more consistently, you also have to understand how the bass are behaving in response to local weather and water conditions.
You know, a lot of anglers believe bass like this can think. How many times have you heard a fisherman say, "Nah, we didn't catch anything. Those fish outsmarted me"? Well, that really isn't true. Fish don't think and make decisions like you and I do. All they understand is the immediate environment that they're living in. You don't have to outsmart a bass to catch them. All you have to do is understand them.
Al Lindner is a master angler because he always keeps a few big ideas clear in his mind. The fact that bass don't think, they just react to their environment, is one of the basic principles of successful bass fishing. But how do they react? How do bass sense the environment and respond to it? Doug Hannon feels that understanding the bass's basic nature is the key to successful fishing.
Bass fishermen always wonder, how well can a bass see? What do they really hear? Is their sense of smell as good as they say it is? Let's forget about the myths that cloud these issues and look at the facts. The bass has excellent eyesight and can track down his prey easily in pitch dark or in bright sunlight.
One of the biggest myths about bass is that they hide from direct sunlight because it hurts their eyes. They don't have eyelids, the story goes, so they have to stay in the shade.
The truth is, eyelids serve no real purpose in blocking the sun's rays. Their function is to keep the eyes moist. A fish doesn't have eyelids because he doesn't need any. When you live in the water, your eyes stay moist without them.
Bass are not afraid of the sun. They often bask in direct sunlight in shallow water. However, it is a fact that shady areas are often the best for catching bass. That's because when bass are active, hunting food, they use shade like any other form of cover to conceal themselves and ambush their prey or your lure.
Light levels can affect bass in all locations. It actually determines how they position themselves and how active they can be. Let me show you what I mean. In shallow water areas like a clump of lily pads, during low light, the fish will be on the outside edge of the pads near holes, an easy place to get to. During high sunlight, they'll tuck underneath the pads in heavy cover, difficult to make a presentation. You move out on the flats during low light, the fish will ride high above the weeds. Again, it's easy to get a lure to them. During high direct sun, they sink down in the weeds, makes presentation difficult again. You move out on a weed line, and during low light, the fish will be out on the outside edges, fairly aggressive, easy places to get lures to. This will give you a better idea on how sun can affect the bass's position. Let's pretend the sun is here, and that's a sun ray. This side of the weed line will be shaded. The fish will move further out on the edges and be very active. I can catch these fish. Directly across the lake, in another weed line, the sun is penetrating right in there. These fish suck up into the weeds. Presentation is difficult. The fish aren't active. Fishing's tough. Light is something most fishermen don't pay as much attention to as they should.
A bass depends primarily on its sense of sight to capture food. That's why light and shade and water clarity are so essential to understanding the behavior factor. But what about the bass's sense of hearing? We know that a bass has ears, but what does it really use them for?
This is also contrasted by the fact that sound is very non-directional underwater. That is, it's very difficult for a bass to find and locate the source of a noise.
As a diver, Doug Hannon knows this point well. Underwater, you simply cannot determine the direction of a noise that is more than a few feet away from you. Although a bass can hear every sound in the water, it cannot home in on the source. A lure that makes a loud rattling sound may make bass more alert and aggressive, but it will not attract them from a long distance. Underwater observations show that bass can locate prey such as crayfish by the soft, subtle sounds they make. But the bass has to be very close to where the sound is coming from.
Hearing is also important, but not so much as sight. This makes me tend to avoid the artificial noise chamber type lures and the fast retrieving lures such as the fast crankbait in favor of lures that make only spontaneous and natural noises from contact with the bottom and other underwater objects.
What about the sense of smell? Research shows that bass have noses and can detect odors or traces of chemicals in the water. However, it appears that they use this sense mostly for spawning.
The nature of our sport leads many fishermen to develop an emotional attachment to certain techniques and methods. Lure scents are no exception here. But we must remember that even fish with a very good sense of smell, like trout, salmon, feed primarily by sight. So it is with the bass. This leads me to believe that we might place too much emphasis on the use of lure scents in our bass fishing.
The formula for success deals with the bass as a creature of its environment. The bass uses a location because the environment meets the bass's needs for survival. It reacts to the environment through its senses of sight, hearing, and smell. When you go fishing, your lure becomes part of that environment. But what is it about a lure that makes the bass strike? How does the lure affect the senses of a bass? What other conditions in the environment make the bass more or less likely to strike a lure? Those are the things a master angler thinks about when going after bass.
You know, there's a lot of theories why a bass hits lures. Anger, hunger, curiosity, size, color, action, the list goes on and on. But we gotta be careful. Bass don't think or feel like we do. They simply react. They do what they have to do.
These incredible shots from Glenn Lau's film, Feeding Habits of the Bass, show how bass hit lures. Sometimes the fishing is hot and the bass seem to smash just about any kind of lure. Other times the fishing is really slow and you can't seem to get the bass to bite anything. We simply don't know all the reasons why bass hit lures. Maybe we never will. However, master anglers know that certain ideas and theories about lures help them catch more bass more consistently.
That theory is called the strike zone concept. It's really a simple idea. What it amounts to is there's an area around the bass that if you make the right presentations with the right lure, he's gonna hit it. Now the size of that area is determined by the fish's activity. When they're aggressive, active, that strike zone is pretty big. Fishing's easy. When they're not aggressive, inactive, that strike zone is real restricted. Fishing's tough. It's just that simple.
The strike zone is a sign of how the bass relates to its environment. Stable conditions tend to make the strike zone large. Instability, like a cold front going through, makes it small. Warm water, in the 70s and lower 80s, speeds the bass's metabolic rate and increases the size of the strike zone. Colder water, 50s and 40s, decreases the strike zone. The strike zone concept gives you a method for predicting how active the bass will be, and that affects your fishing strategy. Now watch how Al Lindner uses the strike zone concept to find bass on a large flat.
Boy, I'll tell you what, this is one good-looking flat. It's got everything you need. Big tufts of weeds growing all over the place. They're forming little pockets and edges, things that bass love to relate to. The question is, what part of the flats have the bass on it? Are they scattered all over the flat, or are they in a given area of the flat? To find this out, we choose lures that we can fish fast and somewhat efficient. The object is to cover a lot of water quick. You're looking for the most aggressive fish on this given area. To illustrate the strategy, I start out by trying to find any active bass on a flat. I cast my fast-moving lure, in this case a spinnerbait, to the edges where the active bass are most likely to be, the outside edge and over pockets on a flat. If there are any active bass in this location, my presentation will quickly find them. If I make contact and catch one, I'll stay on this location with the fast-moving lure until I've caught and released as many active bass as I can find.
With the formula for success, Al knows that the most active, most catchable bass will strike a fast-moving bait. With that knowledge, he develops a strategy for finding bass in any kind of water the most fast and efficient way possible. Let's see how Charlie Farmer uses that same fast and efficient strategy on a big reservoir.
My purpose is to eliminate the water that doesn't hold bass, and to do that, I'll use the tools and techniques that that will effectively cover the most area in the least amount of time.
You know, a point has a lot of subtle features that hide the bass. We may not know they're there, and to eliminate a lot of the water, a crankbait is the best lure to use. And the reason for this is we can fish it quickly, it goes down deep, and we can cover an awful lot of water very efficiently. One of my favorite techniques is called fan casting, where I use a semicircle and I cast about 3 times in each direction. I cover that water, and if there's a bass down there, I'm going to get him.
First, I'll cast straight out, and I'll make a couple of casts here, right in front of me. Then I'll move over to the other side, make a cast here, here, and here, a good fan cast pattern. I'll then take the trolling motor and move to one side of the point. Actually, I'm casting right over the point, a nice semicircle fan cast, about 6 points here, here. One of the important things to do is I want to cover all that water, 6 nice, evenly spaced casts. Whether you're retrieving the lure fast or slow, don't rely totally on a steady retrieve. Stop the lure on occasion or jerk it, like this. Experiment a little bit.
Do you know how to change your strategy when the bass aren't biting for you? The behavior factor will help. You'll understand how conditions in the water affect the bass's ability to sense your lure. With the strike zone concept, you'll have a good idea of how active the bass may be. Then you'll be able to put the location and behavior factors together to pick the right lure. How? Well, that's the next step in the 3M Mastery Formula for Success. Most anglers think that picking the right bait is the secret to success. But as Al Lindner shows you, a successful presentation takes more than a lucky lure.
There's no doubt about it. There's a lot of lures that catch bass. That's the good news. The bad news is this vast variety of lures, sizes, colors, shapes scare off a lot of fishermen. Most bass fishermen only know how to use 1 or 2 of these baits in 1 or 2 conditions. In actuality, the key to fishing success is versatility. Choosing a right lure for the right conditions really isn't that hard. Basically, the lure is your invitation to the fish, an invitation to dinner. Hey, how do you make that invitation work? First, you pick a lure that'll definitely get into where the fish is living, the particular area you're fishing. Secondly, you want a lure that'll attract the fish, it'll appeal to his senses. Third, you want a lure that is fast, can be fished fast, and is still efficient. To pick a lure, you got to ask yourself 3 questions. Am I fishing deep water or shallow water? Am I fishing in cover or out and around cover? How fast can I fish this particular lure and still keep it in the fish's strike zone? These 3 major characteristics make the difference between using a right lure or the wrong lure in the conditions you're faced with.
Now that you've seen how to think about the major characteristics of a lure, Doug Hannon will take you even further into the details of selecting the right baits to catch bass.
Every lure you use has certain qualities. I call these attracting and triggering qualities. Attracting qualities are enough to arouse a fish's curiosity, perhaps make him approach your lure, but not enough to make him hit it.
What are some of these attracting qualities? A large size, bright fluorescent colors, a short, squat shape, and a noisy, rattling sound. Attracting qualities become very important when light levels are low, or the water is dark and stained. Triggering qualities are primarily visual features that actually provoke a strike. These features include a natural color or appearance, compact small size, eye spots, a long, thin, streamlined shape, erratic motion, and a fast retrieve. When the water is clear and light levels are high, the bass can see better, and triggering qualities become more important than attracting qualities.
Ideally, it takes a particular combination of attracting and triggering qualities to catch bass in a given situation. How do I choose which lure to use? simply by understanding the relationship between these attracting and triggering qualities and adjusting them to fit the situation.
Like a master angler, you can use the formula for success to put it all together. The location you decide to fish will affect your basic choice of lure. You think of the bass's behavior in terms of its strike zone, and that determines how fast you retrieve the lure. You look at other factors, like light and water clarity, to balance the triggering and attracting features in your lure. You keep the big picture clear in your mind. The lure is just a tool that must match the conditions you face.
What a beautiful fish. That's where one belongs. Back in the lake.
Now watch as Charlie Farmer puts it all together, using the formula for success to catch bass where other anglers often fail.
Good areas even exist right in the middle of the lake. And there are areas, even on a lake that receives a lot of fishing pressure, where there are schools of bass that rarely, if ever, see a lure.
First, Charlie uses the location factor. He knows that bass are object-oriented fish, so they could be relating to bottom structure of this lake. It has big sunken islands that used to be bluffs along the old river channel. These locations offer deep water sanctuaries, shallow water feeding areas, and good migration routes. He uses a lake map and depth sounder to find the location, and his chart recorder confirms there are fish in that spot.
Notice we've got a good number of fish right here. These are little curves. They're thicker on one side, which means these fish are moving a little bit. And when they're moving, the chances are they're feeding, and they're a little bit easier to catch than those ones that may be stationary. Also, we've got some structure down on the bottom. Notice these fish are not hugging the bottom. They're up off the bottom. Sometimes we can use the countdown method to present a lure right down to exactly to where those fish are. And if they're feeding, we're going to catch them.
Charlie considers the behavior factor. The bass are moving and probably feeding with fairly large strike zones. Then he puts the location and behavior factors together to select a presentation.
Choose a jig that's heavy enough for good line control, such as this 1/2 ounce jig. Also important, a good stiff weed guard that prevents you from getting hung up on the bottom a lot. Make sure the throat of the hook is wide enough so you have a better chance of getting the hook into the fish. Color isn't a major consideration when fishing deep water, as most bright colors turn dull anyway. I prefer black and brown jigs for good all-around fishing. Remember, when fishing deep water structure, you have a lot of line between that bait and that tip of the rod. That's why I like to use a rod that's good and stout, and at the same time has a sensitive tip which telegraphs even the lightest of taps.
He knows that the presentation factor includes not only picking the right lure, but also using the right equipment and fishing the lure in a way that will put it into the strike zones of as many bass as possible.
Cast the lure, let the line feed out until it reaches the bottom. Take up the slack and turn the reel handle about 2 turns. This puts the lure about 1 foot above the bottom. Jig the lure up and down a few times, reel a couple of turns, and continue jigging. This way you can work from the bottom up and get to those bass that may be lingering several feet from the bottom. Like most structure fishermen, I've found that deeper structures, like this, hold bass more consistently than the shallower structures.
Charlie Farmer has just shown you how to use fishing knowledge and the formula for success to catch bass in a tough location. But that's just one condition. Bass thrive in many locations and conditions on the water can change from season to season, day to day, or even minute to minute. That means successful bass anglers must have versatility, the ability to use many different kinds of presentation. To understand this principle, Watch how Al Lindner fishes exactly the same spot through the course of a year. In early spring, this shallow bay has no weed growth for the bass to relate to, but the warm water draws them in from the depths of the lake. He uses a tandem spinnerbait to cover a lot of water as fast as possible. Later in the spring, when the lily pads have started to emerge, there's much less open water to swim a fast-moving lure through. Al uses a moss boss, a spoon-type lure that moves over the pads in patches of open water like a little toy boat. Each time it hits the water, it enters the potential strike zone of a big bass. When summer arrives, lily pads choke out the bay. Now Al has to carefully pick and choose the little holes in the cover, looking for an opportunity to drop a lure into a strike zone. He uses a frog, hopping it off the pads, into the water, in front of a big fish. The cover declines in fall, but the bass don't leave shallow water right away. The open patches are back, and Al can use a fast-moving topwater lure, a buzzbait, to search for any active fish in this location. Do you think you can pick one good lure and stay with it all day? Not if you want to match the conditions and catch a lot of bass. Early in the morning, Al is on a hot summer pattern. Fish riding the tops of weeds on the flats, smashing a buzzbait. Now, as the sun gets higher, the light drives the bass further down into the weeds. Al makes a mid-course correction. The conditions now demand a slower, deeper-running bait, fished with an up and down motion. A spinnerbait matches those conditions. The result? Bass on. The 3M Mastery Formula for Success. It can turn you into a better angler, not by telling you what to do, but by helping you understand the reasons why certain tips and techniques work. That can eliminate a lot of confusion and frustration, especially when you hear conflicting ideas. For example, how do you fish a crankbait? Do you run it parallel to structure or at a right angle? Let's see how two experts do it.
In most lakes, parallel fishing is done along the break line. These areas are often the scatter point where bass begin to disperse into shallow water at the end of the migration route. Break lines are fast-dropping ledges, usually occurring at the same depth along their entire length. Once the depth of the break line has been established, follow it using the depth finder. Cast the lure directly in front of you. This puts the lure close to the bass. Use the lure type that gives you the greatest control at the depth you're fishing. Crankbaits are excellent choices on shallow break lines.
Charlie Farmer fishes the crankbait in a parallel style along the break line. Here, Al Lindner has just marked the weed line on a point. The weed line is a kind of break or edge, similar to what Charlie is fishing. Al's going to fish the weed line with a crankbait. Does he retrieve the crankbait parallel to the weed line? No. He retrieves it at a right angle, away from the weed line. So who's right? How do you fish a crankbait? Parallel or perpendicular? Actually, they're both following the formula for success. They're matching presentation to the location and behavior of the bass. Charlie's mental picture of the lake bottom tells him that the bass are relating to the break line only at a certain depth, near a steep, rocky drop-off. So he retrieves the lure directly along the break. That keeps his lure in the strike zone of as many bass as possible. Al knows the bass may be up in the weeds, on the weed line, or on the drop-off outside the weeds. By retreating at a right angle, he can fish all three spots on each cast. searching for the bass with the biggest strike zones. Over the course of a day, that strategy can help him catch more fish and find the bigger fish.
Hey, by now I'm sure you realize that there's a lot of ways to catch bass. You know, nothing in fishing is 100%. Fact of the matter is, many of the locations and lure choices we've been going over don't work all the time, but they do work most of the time. And that's what we want you to understand. These are guides, they're principles to point you in the right direction to help you to start to catch fish more consistently. Hey, don't go on the water and have a set idea of what fishing should be. Keep an open mind always. And remember one thing, the greatest fishing tool you have is right here.